All right, for our presentation, we are doing the Roaring 20s. So I'm Nick Fredrickson.
I'm Sarah Metzger.
I'm Colin Sloan.
And I'm Carter Sable.
So our learning objectives, we want you to know what the Volstead Act was and what its effects were.
And also why the Prohibition happened, how the Prohibition increased the jazz music fans, and also how the culture of jazz music was changed by both white and blacks.
Explaining what speakeasies are and their impact on jazz.
And then the mob and their background, and then the mob's impact on jazz.
So first, what was the Volstead Act? It was the National Prohibition Act. It came into law on October 28th, 1919, but it was only began being enforced on January 17th, 1920, which is also Al Capone's birthday is January 17th. The purpose was to prohibit intoxicating beverages, to regulate the manufacture, but it also wanted to make sure that they still had alcohol for scientific research and other legal uses that they deemed legal. It was vetoed by Woodrow Wilson, but it was overridden by the House on the same day, and then the next day it was overridden by the Senate, so it still became law. And it was passed after years of support from the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. Many women believed that alcohol promoted wife beating and child abuse, so that's why they supported prohibition. And then its impact on jazz, women began getting invited to nightclubs more often, whereas before the Prohibition they weren't really invited. The number of people drinking increased, and people thought that the law was too strict, so they wanted to loosen up and have fun. And since jazz music was considered fun and it kind of loosened people up, it became extremely popular during Prohibition.
And the Prohibition, originally in 1851, Maine started to make very strict laws to prohibit alcohol, and the working class was very mad at this because the working class liked to drink a lot or significantly after work or when they were stressed out. And in January 19th, 1920, the Prohibition of the whole United States was enacted, and then the creators of the Prohibition were worried for Americans' health and safety because of their excessive drinking. And originally, they prohibited alcohol after World War I, just because this was in like 1917 because grain needed to be saved to make more food for everyone. And bootlegging, which is the illegal sale and creation of alcohol, increased as a result. And also, bootlegged alcohol was very expensive. And again, this made the working class and the poorer people angry because they couldn't afford it and only the rich people could. And moonshine was one of the drinks that was made by bootleggers. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, and he appealed the 21st Amendment, which allowed the prohibition of alcohol to end. And the Prohibition and its impact on jazz, the creation of commercial radio increased the amount of people who actually listen to jazz music, so more people started hearing across the country more different types of jazz and started listening to it more. And then black and whites came together to create new music with their cultures kind of interacting. And Duke Ellington and Bix Beiderbecke were also during this time. And the first Prohibition recording was called Save a Little Dram for Me, and this is by Bert Williams. And we will play a couple seconds of that.
In the middle of his firm.
So yeah, that was the first recording of jazz. The first jazz recording during the Prohibition, and it wasn't really that the one we just showed wasn't the real recording. It was the closest one I could find to the real one.
So speakeasies. A speakeasy is hidden parts of establishments that were created to illegally sell alcohol during the Prohibition. To enter, one person would need to know the password and say it to the door person who is standing watch. They would have to be able to. The door person would have to be able to determine if the person trying to enter was from the government or not, and the government, if they tried, they would have to. If the government tried to come in and bust the speakeasy, the doorman would warn everybody inside. The word speakeasy comes from a bartender's term. People who are supposed to speak easy at the bar, meaning not to draw any suspicion towards buying alcohol by looking nervous or talking quickly. It has been said that for every legal saloon before Prohibition, at least half a dozen speakeasies were put up after Prohibition. And some of the slang words that were used to fool the police when talking about speakeasies and alcohol were coffin varnish, white mule, horse liminent, monkey rum, panther sweat, and many more. The impact on jazz. With the passing of the 18th Amendment, Prohibition in America had a profound effect on music in the 1920s and eventually led to the intermingling of black and white cultures through the medium of music. Jazz musicians found great employment opportunities in the numerous new nightclubs and speakeasies. They formed friendship with the gangsters, who were sometimes their biggest fans and occasionally their foes or protectors, and benefited from vital scenes that flourished in cities rife with corruption. The owners of these speakeasies quickly discovered that they had to rely on lesser-known jazz musicians to provide the entertainment for their establishments. Because they had to hire lesser-known musicians, this meant that they were going to be hiring mostly local black musicians, which turned out to be the best idea yet. Soon, speakeasies everywhere were adopting that idea, and jazz blew up in the speakeasy community.
Okay, so the Italian Mafia, or the mob, was an organized crime organization that originated during the 1920s. They were very active in certain cities like New York and Chicago. The mob was very active during the 20s, highly due to Prohibition. With the ban of alcohol, bootlegging became a very profitable business, and the mob took over highly populated cities and began selling liquor to speakeasies. So Al Capone, one of the most notorious mobsters ever, was the source of bootleg liquor in Chicago. Capone's operations brought in over $100 million per year. Al Capone was a leader who was beloved by the public but also hated by the public at the same time. He is indirectly responsible for several murders and other various crimes, and he was caught in June of 1931, where he was indicted of 22 counts of income tax evasion. That's what it is. And now their impact on jazz. They influenced jazz in many ways, especially during the 20s and 30s. With the Prohibition era, in fact, speakeasies ran rampant, which in turn gave jazz performers and singers many opportunities for work. The mob established many speakeasies, and with that, jazz performers were needed to play at these establishments for parties and all that. Jazz performers were also allowed to get more creative in these types of atmospheres. They were allowed to try new styles and rhythms. With the outbreak of speakeasies, more and more jazz musicians were able to find their talents and thrive. Jazz musicians and the mob benefited off of each other in a sense. The musicians got paid and also got popularity, and the speakeasies and the mobsters got profit and more customers.
So our summary to our learning objectives: the Prohibition happened in result to people being worried for the health of Americans. And then more people started listening to jazz music because of the invention of the commercial radio, which helped spread the music to many different homes across the states. And white and blacks then worked together to combine their music styles to change the style of jazz music.
Speakeasies, the main thing you need to remember is that it's hidden parts of establishments that were created to illegally sell alcohol during the Prohibition, and jazz musicians found their best employment in speakeasies and were protected by gangsters, who were also some of their biggest fans.
And the mob, run by gangsters, typically operated speakeasies that employed jazz musicians, and the mob gave those musicians job opportunities and also gave them profit.
And that was our PowerPoint on the Roaring 20s.